Somewhere in a small velvet box, a diamond sits on a finger, and it is supposed to say something. Forever. Unbreakable love. A month's salary, tradition insists, well spent. Almost everyone who has shopped for an engagement ring has felt the same quiet pressure that a diamond is not really optional, that its value is simply a fact of nature, like the boiling point of water or the weight of gold. But that feeling, as intuitive as it seems, was built. Diamonds are not naturally rare. They are one of the most abundant, gem-quality minerals on Earth, and the belief that they are precious was manufactured, deliberately and methodically, by a single company over the course of a century. Start with the misconception. Because it collapses almost immediately under scrutiny, rarity, in the strict geological sense, means a substance is hard to find in usable quantities. Diamonds do not meet that definition. They form under conditions that exist throughout the Earth's mantle, roughly 90 to 120 miles down, wherever carbon is subjected to extreme heat and pressure. Over long stretches of time, volcanic eruptions called kimberlite pipes bring them to the surface, and geologists have identified thousands of these pipes across the planet, on nearly every continent. When large diamond deposits were discovered in South Africa in the late 1800s, so much rough diamond material came out of the ground so quickly that mine owners panicked, not because they had struck it rich, but because they understood a basic law of economics. If diamonds became too abundant, their price would collapse into something closer to that of quartz or industrial abrasive, which, chemically and structurally, is essentially what a diamond is. It is simply crystallized carbon, made of the same element as pencil, graphite, and charcoal, arranged into a different lattice. The gap between a diamond and a lump of coal is not one of essential nature, but of atomic geometry, and geometry alone does not explain why one sells for thousands of dollars and the other heats a furnace. So if diamonds are not naturally scarce, why does everyone feel like they are? The answer lies not in geology, but in supply chain engineering. And this is the core mechanism worth understanding, because it is a masterclass in artificial scarcity. Imagine a farmer who grows more wheat than the market could ever need. If he sells all of it, the price of wheat drops to almost nothing. But if that farmer, and every other wheat farmer in the world, agreed to funnel their entire harvest through a single warehouse, and that warehouse decided each year exactly how much wheat would be released to bakeries, the price could be held wherever the warehouse wanted, regardless of how much wheat sat rotting in storage. This is essentially the model that a company named De Beers built, starting in the 1880s. Cecil Rhodes and his partners consolidated South Africa's major diamond mines under one company, and by the early 20th century, De Beers controlled the overwhelming majority of the world's rough diamond supply. It did not just mine diamonds, it became the warehouse. Nearly every diamond mined anywhere, whether De Beers dug it up or not, had to pass through the company's central selling organization. Before reaching a jeweler, De Beers would stockpile diamonds during periods of oversupply, hold them off the market for years if necessary, and release only a carefully calculated volume each year, enough to satisfy demand without ever satisfying it fully. Scarcity was not discovered, it was administered, one vault at a time. Controlling supply solved half the problem. The other half was demand, and this is where the economic reality becomes almost uncomfortable to examine, because it reveals how thoroughly a cultural instinct can be engineered, rather than inherited. In the late 1930s, diamond sales in the United States, the largest market in the world, were sluggish. Engagement rings existed, but they were one option among many, and plenty of couples chose sapphires, rubies, or no stone at all. De Beers hired an advertising agency, ND-IR, to fix this, and the agency's solution was not to advertise diamonds as a product, but to advertise them as a psychological requirement. The 1947 campaign produced the phrase, "A diamond is forever," a line built specifically to discourage resale. If a diamond is eternal, if it symbolizes a love that supposedly cannot be undone, then reselling it back into the market would feel almost sacrilegious. Compare that to gold, which flows constantly between buyers, sellers, and institutions, forming an active secondary market that keeps its price tethered to real-time supply and demand. Diamonds were engineered to avoid that fate. Once a diamond was purchased, the campaign's success meant it was very unlikely to reappear on the market, which kept De Beers's controlled supply from ever having to compete with a flood of second-hand stones. The campaign went further, placing diamond rings in Hollywood films, coaching magazine editors on how to frame jewelry in high-society photography, and eventually promoting the idea that an engagement ring should cost roughly 1 to 2 months of a man's salary, a guideline invented from nothing, with no basis in the actual cost of mining or cutting the stone. It worked so well that by the 1990s, over 80% of American brides received a diamond engagement ring, a cultural near universal that had simply not existed 60 years earlier. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because the diamond industry represents one of the clearest examples in modern economic history of demand being manufactured to match an artificially constrained supply, rather than supply naturally responding to demand. Most markets work in the opposite direction. A shortage of lumber raises the price of lumber, because builders already needed lumber, but no one in 1870 needed a diamond ring. The need, or at least the powerful cultural expectation of the need, was constructed afterward, specifically, to make an abundant stone behave economically like a scarce one. The brutal logic underneath this is simple. If you control the only pipeline through which a good reaches the market, and you also control the story people tell themselves about why they want that good, you effectively control its price, almost independent of how much of it actually exists underground. The system, however, could not hold forever, and its erosion tells its own story about how difficult monopolies are to sustain. Once outsiders sensed the profit being left on the table. Throughout the 20th century, De Beers's grip loosened gradually as new diamond deposits were discovered in places the company did not control, particularly in Russia, Canada, and Australia, and as some producers began selling independently rather than through the central pipeline. Then, starting in the 2010s, an entirely different kind of disruption arrived: laboratory-grown diamonds. These are chemically, optically, and structurally identical to mined diamonds, indistinguishable to the naked eye, and often only distinguishable to gemologists. Using specialized equipment, they are grown in machines that replicate the heat and pressure conditions found deep in the Earth's mantle, compressing the process from hundreds of millions of years into a matter of weeks. Because they sidestep the entire mining and central distribution apparatus, lab-grown diamonds have historically sold for a fraction of the price of mined stones, and that price gap has continued to widen as the technology has scaled. This has forced the natural diamond industry into a strange rhetorical position, spending heavily to convince consumers that a lab-grown stone, despite being physically identical at the molecular level, is somehow less authentic or less meaningful than one pulled from a kimberlite pipe. It is a distinction rooted almost entirely in narrative, since a jeweler's loupe often cannot tell the two apart at all. Zooming out, the diamond story is not really about diamonds. It is about how a mineral, with virtually no functional advantage over its cheaper laboratory-grown twin, and no inherent scarcity relative to hundreds of other equally uncommon gemstones, became one of the most emotionally loaded purchases a person can make. Compare this to something like the honeybee, trucked across a continent. Because human agriculture demanded a pollination system nature never intended to scale that way, or the modern chicken, bred into a shape its own skeleton can barely support. In each case, an industry did not simply respond to a natural condition, it reshaped a natural or economic reality to fit a profit model, then convinced the public that the reshaped version was the way things had always been. The diamond industry did this more successfully than almost any other, not through the substance's intrinsic properties, but through nearly a century of coordinated control over both the vault and the imagination. None of this means diamonds are worthless, or that the emotion attached to giving one is false. People genuinely feel what they feel when they open that velvet box, and that feeling is real regardless of its origin story. But the price tag attached to that feeling was not handed down by nature, it was constructed, brick by brick, by men who understood that if you can control what leaves the warehouse, and control what story people tell about why they want it, you can make a common stone behave like a rare one for 100 years. The Earth never agreed that diamonds were priceless. That agreement was reached in boardrooms, advertising offices, and Hollywood screening rooms, long after the stone itself had already been sitting in the ground, indifferent, for over 1 billion years. What finally moved the needle was not a change in geology, but a change in who controlled the pipeline, a reminder that scarcity, real or invented, is very often a decision rather than a law of nature.